The city's most feared monster had just given the order to burn it all down. Standing amidst the smoke and blood of Warehouse 9, Viktor the Iron Volkov looked every bit the devil his enemies whispered about. His scream, "Take everything," was a death sentence, a command to erase a rival bloodline from existence. His men, fingers white-knuckled on their triggers, waited for the final nod to turn the room into a graveyard. But then the heavy steel door groaned open, and the impossible happened. A 4-year-old girl in a soot-stained white dress walked through the line of fire, her small boots clicking on the blood-slicked concrete. She didn't flinch at the guns or the snarling men. She walked straight to the center of the carnage and gripped Viktor's massive scarred hand. In that second, the silence was more deafening than the screaming. The man who had never shown mercy began to shake. He looked down into her amber eyes, eyes that belonged to a ghost from his past, and saw a tarnished locket that changed everything. The iron didn't just bend, he shattered, because the girl didn't see a monster, she saw her only way home. Click the like button and subscribe to this channel for more story. Now let's continue. The rain over the shipping docks of Oakhaven didn't just fall, it shattered against the rusted corrugated steel of Warehouse 9, a rhythmic drumming that underscored the heavy breathing of broken men. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of ozone, cheap tobacco, and the copper tang of fresh blood. Viktor the Iron Volkov stood at the center of the chaos, a pillar of dark cashmere and cold fury. His silhouette was carved out by the flickering overhead industrial lights, casting a long, jagged shadow over the kneeling remnants of the Moretti family. For 3 decades, the Morettis had held the northern transit lines. In 30 minutes, Viktor had dismantled 30 years of history. He didn't look like a man who had just survived a firefight. His tie was perfectly knotted, and his silver-streaked hair remained undisturbed, though a single drop of crimson had splattered onto his cheekbone, looking like a macabre tear. Beneath him, Lorenzo Moretti, the youngest and last of the brothers, looked up through a mask of swelling bruises. The defiant pride that usually defined the Moretti name had been ground into the oil-stained concrete. Viktor stepped closer, the soles of his Italian leather shoes clicking with terrifying precision. He didn't need to shout to be heard. The sheer weight of his presence silenced the room. His own men, a wall of black-clad enforcers armed with silenced submachine guns, stood like statues, waiting for the word that would tilt the city's power forever. Viktor's eyes, as gray and unyielding as the metal that gave him his nickname, swept over the crates of contraband, the ledgers of offshore accounts spread across a makeshift table, and the trembling men who had once dared to call him a rival. The betrayal that had led to this night, a hijacked shipment that resulted in the death of 3 of Viktor's most loyal drivers, demanded more than just a tactical response. It demanded an erasure. Viktor leaned down, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to vibrate in the very floorboards. He grabbed Lorenzo by the collar, forcing the younger man to look into the void of his gaze. The world outside the warehouse seemed to vanish, leaving only the 2 of them in a vacuum of impending violence. "You thought the iron could be bent," Viktor whispered, his grip tightening until Lorenzo's breath hitched in a desperate gasp. "You thought that by taking my cargo, you could take my dignity. You were wrong. You didn't just steal from me. You invited me to become the monster you always claimed I was. And now, the bill has come due." Viktor stood abruptly, turning his back on the kneeling men, a gesture of ultimate disrespect. He looked out at his captains, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage that finally broke his calm exterior. The fire he had kept banked all night suddenly roared to the surface. He raised a gloved hand, pointing it toward the heart of the Moretti Empire represented in that room. "Take everything!" Viktor screamed, his voice tearing through the rafters and echoing off the metal walls like a thunderclap. "I want their names erased. I want their accounts drained. I want their homes leveled and their legacy turned to ash. If it breathes, stop it. If it stands, tear it down. Take every single thing they have ever loved." The command was the spark in a powder keg. His men moved with mechanical lethality, the metallic slide of bolts being pulled back, snapping through the room. The air grew electric, the tension reaching a fever pitch where the very oxygen felt like it might ignite. Lorenzo closed his eyes, a sob escaping his throat as he realized there was no mercy left in the world. Viktor stood with his chest heaving, his eyes wide and burning, savoring the moment of total dominance. He was the king of a graveyard, the architect of a ruin, and for a split second, he felt the terrible, hollow satisfaction of a man who had finally destroyed his last enemy. The hammers were cocked. The signal was a heartbeat away. The world was about to end in a hail of lead and fire. But then, in the suffocating heat of that hatred, the heavy steel side door creaked open. A sliver of pale, moonlight gray light cut across the blood-slicked floor, and a small, delicate figure stepped into the center of the war zone. The heavy steel side door groaned on its hinges, a sound that should have been swallowed by the cacophony of barking orders and the rhythmic metallic clatter of weapons being readied. Instead, the screech of metal on metal acted like a jagged blade cutting through the tension. A sliver of the outside world, a pale, rain-washed gray, pierced the amber gloom of the warehouse. Viktor's hand remained raised, his fingers curled like a vulture's claw, frozen in the very gesture intended to signal a massacre. His chest still heaved from the exertion of his roar, but the air in his lungs suddenly felt thin and cold. From the shadows of the doorway stepped a figure so small and so out of place that for a moment, the hardened men of the Volkov syndicate wondered if they were witnessing a collective hallucination. It was a girl, no older than 5, wearing a simple white cotton dress that had been smudged with soot and dampened by the Oakhaven drizzle. Her hair was a tangle of dark curls, and her boots made a soft, rhythmic thump-tap on the blood-slicked concrete. She didn't flinch at the sight of the submachine guns or the snarling men. She didn't seem to see the broken Moretti brothers kneeling in their own despair. She walked with a terrifying, singular purpose. One of Viktor's guards, a man named Marek, who had killed dozens without blinking, instinctively raised his rifle. His finger tightened on the trigger, his mind struggling to process a threat that didn't look like a threat. But as the girl passed him, she didn't even look up. She walked through the invisible line of fire as if she were strolling through a summer meadow. Marek's barrel wavered, then dipped. He looked toward Viktor for guidance, but his boss was a statue of salt. The silence began to settle over the warehouse like a physical weight. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket that dampened the sound of the rain outside and the distant hum of the city. The screaming had died in the throats of the victims. The commands had withered on the lips of the victors. The only sound was the girl's breathing and the soft rustle of her dress. She reached the center of the kill zone, stepping over a discarded brass casing that rolled away with a lonely metallic ring. Viktor the Iron Volkov felt a sensation he hadn't experienced since he was a boy, hiding in the floorboards of a burning house in Moscow. Pure, paralyzing vulnerability. As the girl approached, his vision blurred at the edges, tunneling until all he could see was this tiny, fragile intrusion into his world of iron and ash. She stopped just inches from him. To his men, she looked like a lamb walking into a lion's den. To Viktor, she looked like a ghost he had tried to bury under a mountain of bodies and gold. Without a word, she reached up. Her small, pale hand, unburdened by the weight of a weapon or the stain of a sin, rose through the air. Viktor felt his heart hammer against his ribs, a frantic, uneven beat that defied his legendary composure. He should have pulled away. He should have barked a command to have her removed. He should have finished the work he started. But as her fingers brushed against the rough, scarred skin of his knuckles, his strength vanished. She gripped his hand. Her palm was warm, a startling contrast to the icy, rain-slicked skin of the man known for having a heart of stone. She didn't pull him. She simply held him, her small fingers curling around his thumb with an absolute, terrifying trust. Viktor's hand, which had signed death warrants and crushed windpipes, began to tremble. The tremors started in his fingertips and traveled up his arm, shaking the very foundation of his soul. He looked down into her eyes. They weren't filled with the terror he was used to seeing. They were deep, dark pools of recognition. In that moment, the iron didn't just bend, it shattered. The silence that followed her touch was more deafening than his own scream had been moments before. It was a silence that demanded an accounting. It was a silence that told him the war he had been fighting for 30 years was over, and he had lost in a way he never imagined possible. The men around him watched in stunned disbelief as the most dangerous man in the city bowed his head, his towering frame wilting under the touch of a child. The stillness in the warehouse was no longer the silence of anticipation. It was the silence of a funeral. Viktor Volkov, a man whose reputation was built on the scorched earth of his enemies, stood paralyzed as the small girl's warmth seeped through his leather glove. He felt as though he were standing on the edge of a great precipice, the ground beneath his expensive shoes crumbling into a sea of forgotten memories. Slowly, with a mechanical stiffness that betrayed his internal upheaval, Viktor lowered his gaze. He expected to see a stranger, a casualty of geography, a child who had simply wandered through the wrong door at the worst possible moment of her life. Instead, he found himself staring into a mirror of the past. The girl's eyes were a startling, familiar shade of amber, the color of honey held up to a winter sun. They were the exact eyes of Katya, the younger sister he had failed to protect 15 years ago, the girl whose disappearance had turned his heart into the very iron that gave him his name. For a moment, the blood-soaked concrete of Warehouse 9 vanished, replaced by the ghost of a small apartment in St. Petersburg, filled with the scent of black bread and the sound of Katya's laughter. The resemblance was so jarring, it felt like a physical blow to his chest, knocking the breath from his lungs. His eyes drifted lower, tracing the line of her small, fragile neck, and there he saw it. Dangling from a thin, tarnished silver chain was a heart-shaped locket, scratched and dented by time, but unmistakable. It was a custom piece, etched with a pattern of wild roses that Viktor himself had commissioned for Katya's 10th birthday. He remembered the weight of it in his palm the day he bought it. He remembered the way Katya had promised never to take it off. The sight of it now, resting against the chest of this mysterious child in the middle of a slaughterhouse, caused a roar of static to fill his ears. The world tilted. The screams of the Moretti brothers, the smell of gunpowder, and the weight of his own empire suddenly meant nothing. "Where did you get this?" Victor's voice was no longer a roar. It was a fragile thread, a ghost of a sound that barely carried over the drumming rain. He didn't realize he had dropped to one knee until he felt the cold moisture of the floor seep into his trousers. He was now eye level with the girl, his towering presence reduced to the stature of a supplicant. He reached out with a trembling hand, his fingers hovering just inches from the locket, terrified that if he touched it, she would evaporate into the shadows. The girl didn't speak. She simply tilted her head, her amber eyes searching his face with a wisdom that no child should possess. She didn't need to answer. The locket was a scream from the grave, a message sent across a decade and a half of silence. Viktor's captains moved restlessly in the periphery of his vision. Yuri, his most loyal and lethal lieutenant, stepped forward, his brow furrowed in confusion. The hammers of the guns were still cocked. The order to take everything still hung in the air like a poisoned cloud. "Boss," Yuri's voice was a cautious intrusion. "The signal. We're losing the light. Should we finish this?" Viktor didn't look up. He was staring at the roses on the silver heart, his mind racing through 1,000 impossible scenarios. If this girl had the locket, Katya might still be alive. Or worse, she had been alive long enough to pass it on. The violence he had prepared to unleash felt suddenly grotesque, an insult to the purity of the child standing before him. He couldn't kill these men. Not now, not with Katya's eyes watching him. "Stand down," Viktor whispered. "What?" Yuri asked, his voice cracking with disbelief. "Viktor, they betrayed us. We have them cornered. We take everything, remember?" Viktor stood up, his movements slow and heavy. He kept the girl's hand firmly in his own. He turned to face his men, and for the first time in 30 years, the iron looked human, and therefore terrifyingly unpredictable. "I said stand down," he bellowed, the command echoing with a finality that brooked no argument. "Release them. Clear the warehouse. We are leaving. Now!" The confusion in the room was palpable. The Moretti brothers, who had been bracing for the end, looked up with wide, hollow eyes, unable to comprehend the sudden reprieve. The soldiers lowered their weapons slowly, exchanging glances of pure bewilderment. Their king had gone mad. Viktor didn't care. He tucked the girl under his arm, shielding her from the sight of the broken men on the floor, and walked toward the exit. He had spent his life taking everything from others, but as he stepped into the rain with the child, he realized that for the first time, he was the one being led. The black armored SUV glided through the iron gates of the Volkov estate, a fortress of limestone and bulletproof glass perched high above the jagged cliffs of the coastline. Inside the cabin, the silence was suffocating. Viktor sat in the back, his massive frame cramped against the door, staring at the small girl who sat precisely in the center of the leather bench. She looked like a porcelain doll placed in a cage meant for a beast. The locket around her neck caught the passing light of the security lamps, blinking like a rhythmic warning. He didn't know her name yet, only the weight of the hand she had offered him in the dark. He had called her Mia in his mind, a name from a story his mother used to tell, but as the vehicle hissed to a stop, he realized he didn't even know if she liked the dark or feared the quiet. The estate, usually a hub of hushed whispers and tactical briefings, felt unnervingly empty as Viktor led the child inside. He waved off his domestic staff with a sharp flick of his wrist. He couldn't stomach the idea of his housekeepers or security detail witnessing the cracks in his armor. He took her to the kitchen, a sprawling expanse of industrial stainless steel and cold marble that felt more like a laboratory than a home. Mia sat on a high stool, her legs dangling and swinging back and forth, her boots occasionally kicking the mahogany base with a soft thud. She watched him with those amber eyes, Katya's eyes, unblinking and expectant. Viktor realized with a jolt of genuine panic that he had no idea how to host a child. His world was governed by the procurement of high-yield assets and the elimination of liabilities. It did not include the nutritional requirements of a 5-year-old. He opened the massive walk-in refrigerator, his eyes scanning rows of expensive vodka, aged steaks, and artisanal cheeses. Finally, in the back of a pantry meant for a long-forgotten guest, he found a jar of peanut butter and a squeeze bottle of grape jelly. It felt like discovering a foreign currency. He set the jars on the marble island. His movements were stiff, his large, scarred hands looking absurdly out of scale against the plastic containers. He reached into his waistband and drew his tactical knife, a custom-forged blade of blackened steel, serrated at the base and sharp enough to shave a hair in mid-air. He had used this tool to survive a winter in the Siberian wilderness and to extract information from men who thought they were unbreakable. Now, he used the tip of the lethally sharp blade to scoop a dollop of creamy peanut butter. The contrast was grotesque. The man who had commanded a massacre an hour ago was now meticulously spreading jelly onto a slice of white bread with the focus of a diamond cutter. He was terrified of tearing the bread. He worked in total, agonizing silence, his brow furrowed and a bead of sweat tracing the scar along his temple. When the knife scraped against the stone, the sound was like a gunshot in the sterile room. He sliced the sandwich into 2 perfect triangles, tactical precision applied to a nursery snack, and pushed the plate toward her. "Eat," he said, his voice a gravelly rumble that he tried and failed to soften. Mia looked at the sandwich, then at the blackened blade still in his hand, and then at him. She didn't shrink back. Instead, she picked up a half and took a deliberate bite. A small smudge of jelly caught on the corner of her lip. Viktor reached out instinctively to wipe it away with his thumb, but he froze, his hand hovering in the air. He looked at his own skin, calloused, stained with the indelible memory of gunpowder and grease, and he pulled back, tucking his hand into his pocket. He felt like a bull in a china shop, a monster trying to play house in a world that had no room for his kind of shadow. He watched her eat, a strange, localized warmth blooming in a chest that had been frozen for 15 years. He wanted to ask 1,000 questions. Who sent you? Where is Katya? Is she coming for you? But the words felt too heavy for the air between them. Instead, he simply stood guard. He stood as he always did, back straight, eyes scanning the perimeter. But for the first time, he wasn't looking for an assassin in the trees. He was watching a little girl chew her crusts, wondering how a creature so small could make his entire empire feel like a house of cards waiting for a breeze. The monster was still there, lurking behind his gray eyes, But as Mia reached out and pushed the second half of the sandwich toward him in a silent offering, the Iron Volkov felt a terrifyingly human tear prick at his eyelid. He didn't take the bread, but he didn't look away either. The hum of the estate's industrial air filtration system was the only sound that dared to fill the kitchen, a low, mechanical breathing that mirrored Viktor's own rhythmic restraint. Mia had finished her sandwich, leaving nothing but a few crumbs on the cold marble and the faint, sweet scent of grapes in the air. She didn't ask for water. She didn't ask for her mother. She simply sat there, her small boots finally going still, watching Viktor with a piercing intensity that suggested she was measuring the weight of his soul. Viktor stood by the stainless steel prep station, his tactical knife cleaned and sheathed, yet he felt more defenseless than if he were standing unarmed in a room full of assassins. The silence between them was a bridge he didn't know how to cross, a vast expanse of years and secrets that felt heavier than the mountain the estate was built upon. Then, Mia reached into the small, hidden pocket of her soot-stained white dress. Her movements were slow and deliberate, mimicking the very stoicism Viktor had cultivated in himself over decades of conflict. She pulled out a scrap of paper that had been folded so many times the edges were soft and frayed, looking like a piece of felt rather than parchment. It was yellowed with age and bore the faint, salty scent of the sea. Without a word, she extended her arm, holding the paper out toward him. Viktor hesitated, his large hand hovering over hers, before he gingerly took the fragment. He felt as though he were handling a detonator. One wrong move, and the fragile reality he was clinging to would explode. He unfolded the paper with agonizing care. As the creases smoothed out under his calloused fingers, the breath left his lungs in a sharp, ragged hiss. It wasn't a child's doodle. It was a hand-drawn map, sketched in the distinctive, looping charcoal strokes he would recognize anywhere. The lines were shaky but precise, depicting a coastline he had seen in his dreams every night for 15 years. There were the jagged rocks of the Devil's Teeth, the hidden cove where the water turned a deep, bruised purple, and the solitary silhouette of a leaning pine tree. At the center of the drawing was a small X marked with a splash of dried red ink. This wasn't just a map, it was a ghost. It was the Secret Kingdom, a private geography that only two people in the world had ever known: Viktor and Katya. They had mapped it out on the floor of their cramped apartment in St. Petersburg when they were children, dreaming of a place where the winter couldn't find them and where men with loud voices and heavy boots didn't exist. It was a location that appeared on no official chart, a hidden pocket of the Baltic coast where they had hidden their treasures. A collection of glass beads and carved wood, before the world tore them apart. The realization hit him with the force of a physical collision. Mia wasn't a random victim who had wandered into his war. She was a messenger, a living key sent from a past he had believed was dead and buried. Viktor's fingers began to tremble, the paper crinkling under the sudden pressure of his grip. He looked from the map to the girl, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. "Who gave this to you?" he asked, his voice a low, desperate rasp that cracked with an emotion he hadn't felt in a lifetime. "Where is the woman who drew this?" Mia didn't answer with words. She leaned forward, her small face inches from his, and whispered a single sentence that froze the blood in his veins. She said the iron would remember the way home. The room seemed to contract, the walls of the high-tech kitchen pressing in on him. The phrase was a code, a final safeguard they had whispered to each other the night the soldiers came. It was the ultimate proof. Katya was alive, or at the very least, she had been alive long enough to teach this child the secret language of their shared childhood. Mia hadn't been lost. She had been guided. She had walked through a hail of bullets and past a phalanx of killers because she knew exactly who he was. She didn't see the boss, the monster, or the iron. She saw the boy who used to draw maps on the floor. Viktor closed his eyes, pressing the weathered paper to his forehead. The weight of his empire, the blood on his hands, and the vast, cold network of power he had built suddenly felt like ash. He had spent 15 years looking for vengeance, believing that was all he had left. Now, staring at the charcoal lines of a hidden cove, he realized he had been looking for the wrong thing. He wasn't a king presiding over a city. He was a man with a map, and for the first time in his life, he had a destination. But as he looked at the door, he knew his captains were outside, and they wouldn't let their king chase a ghost without a fight. The cold, clinical glow of the estate's tactical command center flickered against the sharp features of Yuri Volkov, no blood relation, but a man who had shared Viktor's shadow for 20 years. Yuri did not look at the screens displaying the perimeter's thermal feeds. Instead, he stared through the reinforced glass toward the main villa, where a single light burned in the kitchen. In his hand, he rolled a heavy brass casing, the rhythmic clack-clack of metal against his signet ring sounding like the ticking of a countdown. To Yuri, power was a mathematical equation, a balance of fear and absolute predictability. Tonight, Viktor the Iron Volkov had introduced a variable that threatened to reduce their entire equation to zero. A little girl in a white dress had done what 1,000 rival bullets could not. She had made the iron hesitate. "He's compromised," Yuri whispered, his voice a dry rasp that barely carried over the hum of the cooling fans. Behind him, 3 of the syndicate's top captains stood in the shadows, their faces etched with the same simmering unease. They were men who lived by the blade, and they knew that in their world, a moment of sentiment was a death sentence for everyone involved. You saw him in the warehouse. He had the Moretti's throats under his boot, and he let them breathe because a child touched his hand. A king who bows to a ghost is no longer a king. He is a liability. Yuri turned away from the window, his eyes narrowing into slits of calculated malice. He had helped Viktor build this empire out of the rubble of the old world, cementing their status with the bodies of those who mistook kindness for weakness. Now, seeing Viktor huddled over a weathered map and a plate of crustless sandwiches, Yuri felt a sense of profound betrayal. He didn't see a man rediscovering his humanity. He saw a structural flaw in the fortress. The syndicate thrived on the myth of Viktor's invulnerability. If the word got out that the iron had gone soft for a niece or a messenger, every scavenger in the city would begin to circle, smelling blood in the water. "The girl is a distraction," Yuri continued, pacing the length of the room with a predator's grace. "She is a tether to a past that Viktor was supposed to have burned. As long as she breathes, he will be looking backward instead of forward. He is planning a trip to the coast, chasing a charcoal drawing like a fool. He's forgotten that we are at war." He stopped in front of the youngest captain, a man whose loyalty was bought with gold rather than history. "The girl needs to be removed, not just for the good of the family, but to save Viktor from himself. Once she's gone, he'll grieve, he'll rage, and then he'll become the monster we need him to be again." The treason wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow-acting poison. Yuri began to weave the web, using the very security systems Viktor had commissioned to isolate the boss. He issued silent commands to the gate guards, rerouting the patrols so that a blind spot opened up near the kitchen's rear entrance. He tapped into the encrypted comms, sending a series of untraceable pings to the Moretti remnants, a subtle hint that the iron was distracted, an invitation to create a diversion that would draw Viktor's attention away from the villa. Yuri's plan was a masterpiece of shadow work. He wouldn't kill Viktor, not yet. He would simply sanitize the environment, excising the weakness that Mia represented. In his mind, Yuri was already sitting in the high-backed leather chair in the study, the weight of the iron's ring on his own finger. He convinced himself that this was an act of mercy, a way to preserve the legacy they had bled for. But beneath the justification was the cold, hard truth of ambition. He watched the light in the kitchen go out, imagining Viktor tucking the child into a bed of silk and shadows. Yuri felt a flicker of contempt, so hot it tasted like bile. The world didn't belong to men who remembered the way home. It belonged to those who had burned the map and forgotten the faces of their sisters. As the clock struck 3, Yuri signaled his personal strike team, men whose primary loyalty was to his payroll, not the Volkov name. They moved through the corridors like smoke, their boots silent on the plush carpets. They didn't carry the heavy weaponry of a gang war. They carried zip ties and sedatives. They were the janitors of the soul, sent to sweep away the last shred of Viktor's heart before the sun rose. Yuri stood in the darkened command center, the brass casing finally still in his palm. The treason was no longer a thought, it was a heartbeat away from reality. The salt air of the Baltic coast bit into Viktor's skin with the familiar cold of a long-buried secret. Leaving the girl under the heavy guard of the few men he still dared to trust, he had driven north through the pre-dawn mist, following the charcoal lines of the map into a world that time had forgotten. The old lighthouse at the Devil's Teeth stood like a jagged, rotting tooth against the gray horizon, its white paint peeling in great flakes like the skin of a leper. For 15 years, Viktor had avoided this shore, believing it to be the site of his greatest failure. Now, as he stepped out of his car, the rhythmic crash of the bruised purple waves sounded like the heartbeat of a ghost. The silence here was absolute, save for the crying of the gulls and the internal roar of a man about to confront his own history. He forced the rusted iron door of the lighthouse open, the hinges screaming in a pitch that matched the wind. Inside, the air was stagnant, smelling of brine, ancient dust, and something sharply metallic. Viktor climbed the winding stone stairs, his boots echoing with a hollow, lonely thud. He reached the lantern room at the summit, where the rotating lens sat dark and blind. Tucked into a niche behind the glass housing was a small, weather-beaten wooden box, the treasure chest of their youth. Inside, resting atop a bed of dried sea glass, was a modern digital recorder, its battery light blinking a steady, mocking red. Viktor's hand shook as he pressed the play button. The voice that emerged was a whisper from the grave, yet it was undeniably Katya's. It was older, raspier, and weary with the weight of a decade of hiding, but it carried the same melodic lilt that had once been the only light in Viktor's dark life. "Viktor," the recording began, and the iron Volkov felt his knees buckle. "If you are hearing this, Mia found you. She is your blood, Viktor. She is my daughter and your niece. I had to send her because the walls are closing in." Viktor leaned against the cold glass, his forehead pressed against the salt-streaked pane as his sister's words dismantled the last 15 years of his life. Katya revealed a truth that tasted more bitter than the sea spray. She hadn't been taken by the Morettis or any rival syndicate. On the night of the disappearance, she had been intercepted by a man she trusted, a man Viktor considered a brother. Yuri had staged the kidnapping, not to kill her, but to use her as the ultimate invisible leash. Yuri knew that a Viktor with nothing to love was a perfect, unstoppable weapon of war, but a Viktor with a sister was a man who might eventually choose peace over power. To keep Viktor as the Iron Boss, Yuri had convinced him his sister was dead while keeping her imprisoned in a gilded cage of threats and shadows, telling her that if she ever reached out, Viktor would be assassinated by his own men. "He told me you had become a monster, Viktor." Katya's voice trembled through the speaker. "He said you were the one who ordered me to be hidden so I wouldn't be a weakness. I didn't believe him until I saw the news, until I saw what you became. But I couldn't let Mia grow up in the dark. She is the only part of our family that is still pure." The recording hissed with static as Katya explained how she had finally escaped Yuri's watchers, dying of a slow illness, but spending her final months teaching Mia the map and the codes, preparing her for the day she would have to walk into the lion's den to find her uncle. The recording ended with a soft click, leaving Viktor in a silence so profound it felt like the world had stopped spinning. The betrayal wasn't a tactical maneuver from an enemy. It was a foundational lie from the man who sat at his right hand. Yuri hadn't just protected the empire. He had built it on the wreckage of Viktor's soul, feeding him a diet of vengeance and grief to keep him sharp. Viktor looked out at the churning sea, his eyes turning from the gray of iron to the black of a coming storm. Mia wasn't just a messenger. She was the living evidence of a 20-year treason. As the realization settled, a cold, focused clarity took hold of him. He wasn't just a boss anymore, and he wasn't just a monster. He was a father figure with a debt of blood to settle. He turned toward the stairs, the map clutched in his fist, knowing that while he had been searching for the truth at the lighthouse, the traitor was back at the estate, closing the trap around the only thing Viktor had left to love. The drive back from the lighthouse felt like a descent into the deepest circles of a frozen hell. Every mile of asphalt Victor covered was a mile where his soul burned with the realization that he had shared bread, secrets, and blood with a man who had orchestrated the hollow agony of his life. But as he crested the final ridge overlooking his estate, the sight that met his eyes wasn't the fortress of stability he had left behind. It was a crime scene in progress. The peripheral security lights were pulsing a jagged, rhythmic amber, a silent alarm that signaled a breach from within. The gates, usually manned by a phalanx of his most loyal veterans, swung loosely in the wind, their electronic locks bypassed by someone who knew the master overrides. Victor didn't slow down. He accelerated, the engine of his SUV roaring like a wounded predator as he tore through the gravel drive. Inside the main villa, the silence was no longer the peaceful sanctuary of a home. It was the heavy, clinical quiet of a tomb. Victor burst through the heavy oak doors, his tactical pistol drawn and leveled, his eyes scanning for the tiny white dress that had become his only anchor to reality. The kitchen was empty. The marble island where he had meticulously sliced a sandwich was cold and bare, save for a single, shattered glass that lay in a pool of water like a broken promise. There was no sign of a struggle, which was more terrifying than a bloodbath. It meant they hadn't fought her. They had simply taken her. The precision of the abduction spoke of Yuri's involvement, a clean, surgical removal of a liability. Victor's phone vibrated in his pocket, a sharp, buzzing intrusion that felt like a localized earthquake. He pulled it out with a hand that was unnervingly steady. The screen displayed an encrypted message from an untraceable source, but the cadence of the words was unmistakable. It was the cold, mathematical prose of Yuri. "You were never meant to be a father, Victor," the message began, the letters glowing with a sickly blue light against the darkness of the foyer. "You were built to be a weapon. You were the iron, a force that knew no pity and no past. By chasing ghosts at the coast, you have weakened the foundation of everything we built. The girl is currently safe, but she is a parasite feeding on your resolve. Consider this a corrective measure." Victor felt the walls of his own house closing in on him, the shadows stretching to mock his sudden helplessness. He moved toward his private study, his boots echoing with a hollow, frantic rhythm. On his desk, his laptop chimed, opening a live video feed that had been forced onto his hardware. The grainy, night vision footage showed a small, windowless room, a basement cell in one of the syndicate's offshore holding facilities. Mia was sitting on a wooden bench, her small hands folded in her lap, her amber eyes looking directly into the camera as if she knew he was watching. She wasn't crying. She looked exactly like Katya had the night they were separated, brave, quiet, and tragically certain of her fate. The screen flickered, and Yuri's voice filled the room, piped through the estate's intercom system. "I'm giving you a choice, my friend. Return to the monster you were. Order the execution of the Morettis. Reclaim the docks with the fire I know you possess, and erase this weekend from your memory. If you do this, the girl will be sent to a boarding school in Switzerland, well-funded and far away, where she can never distract you again. But if you persist in this delusion of family, if you try to find us, the girl pays for your heart. She is the physical manifestation of your weakness, Victor. I will cut it out so the iron can be pure once more." The ultimatum hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Victor stared at the screen, at the tiny girl who carried his blood and his sister's eyes, and felt a transformation take place within the marrow of his bones. For 20 years, Yuri had shaped him into a monster of greed and vengeance, a creature that took everything to fill a hole that could never be satiated. But Yuri had made a fatal error in his calculations. He thought the girl was Victor's weakness, a soft spot to be exploited. He didn't realize that Mia wasn't a tether to the past. She was a bridge to a future Victor finally felt he deserved to fight for. The rage that filled him now wasn't the chaotic, screaming fury he had displayed in the warehouse. It was a cold, silent, and absolute resolve. He reached out and touched the screen, his thumb tracing the outline of Mia's face. He didn't reply to the message. He didn't call his captains. He knew now that his army was a nest of vipers, bought and paid for by the man who had stolen his life. He walked to the hidden wall safe behind the portrait of his father and dialed a code he hadn't used in a decade. As the heavy steel door hissed open, it didn't reveal ledgers or gold. It revealed a single unmarked bag filled with high explosives, a tactical vest, and the blackened steel of a suppressed rifle. Viktor the Iron Volkov was indeed going to return to being a monster, but not the one Yuri expected. He was going to become the monster that hunted the men who had dared to touch his heart. The transition from king to ghost happened in the span of a single, rhythmic breath. Viktor Volkov stood in the center of his armory, the fluorescent lights overhead buzzing like a hornet's nest. For decades, his power had been measured by the number of men who stood behind him, the vastness of the shadows he cast across the city, and the weight of the crown he wore. But as he cinched the straps of his tactical vest and checked the action on his custom-built rifle, he realized that the crown was nothing but a gilded noose. To save Mia, he couldn't be the boss. He couldn't command a legion of mercenaries whose loyalties were as fluid as the ink on a payroll check. To be a protector, he had to become a singular, devastating force, a man with no empire to lose and only one life to reclaim. He didn't call for a convoy. He didn't signal his captains. He knew that every radio frequency was compromised and every loyalist was likely under the barrel of Yuri's betrayal. Instead, he descended into the bowels of the estate, to the garage where his blacked-out, high-performance pursuit vehicle sat in wait. He felt a strange, cold lightness in his chest. For years, his motto, "Take everything," had been a war cry of greed, a demand for more territory, more gold, and more blood. Tonight, it was a vow of absolute reclamation. He wasn't going to take their assets. He was going to take their breath, their security, and their lives until there was nothing left but the child. The drive to the offshore holding facility, a reinforced concrete bunker disguised as a fish processing plant, was a blur of predatory focus. The rain had turned into a torrential downpour, washing the world in shades of slate and obsidian. Viktor arrived at the perimeter like a phantom. He didn't breach the front gate with an explosion. He moved through the shadows of the cooling towers, his movements a symphony of silenced lethality. The first guard fell before he could even register the movement in the dark, a single, precise strike that ended a life without a sound. Viktor moved with a fluidity that he hadn't used in years, the iron finally heated and forged into a blade. As he entered the main facility, the alarms finally shattered the silence, a red strobe light bathing the concrete walls in the color of an open wound. Yuri's voice crackled over the intercom, mocking and frantic, but Viktor didn't listen. He had tuned out the noise of the world. He moved through the corridors, a wraith of blackened steel. Every time he turned a corner, he applied the "take everything" philosophy. He took the lights with precision shots to the junction boxes. He took the tactical advantage by using the very steam pipes his enemies hid behind. He took the lives of every man who stood between him and the basement cell, not out of malice, but out of a mechanical necessity. The resistance was fierce. Yuri had banked on Viktor's age and his softness for the girl. He had stationed 20 of the syndicate's most hardened killers in the central hub. But they were fighting for a paycheck, and Viktor was fighting for the only thing that made his pulse mean something. He moved through the hail of lead with a terrifying disregard for his own safety. He was a man who had already faked his death in his heart. The bullets could only catch up to what was left of his body. He utilized the narrow hallways to funnel the attackers, turning their superior numbers into a tactical bottleneck. Each flash of his muzzle was a punctuation mark in a story that was rapidly coming to its final page. He reached the heavy steel door of the detention wing, his vest shredded and a jagged gash weeping blood down his left arm. He didn't pause. He didn't negotiate. He planted a localized breaching charge, the shockwave rattling his teeth as the door was blown inward. He stepped through the smoke, his rifle leveled at the center of the room. Yuri stood there, a panicked shadow holding a pistol to the glass of the cell, but Viktor's focus was solely on the small girl sitting on the bench. Mia looked up, and for the first time, Viktor saw a flicker of fear in her eyes, not of him, but for him. "You're a fool, Viktor!" Yuri screamed, his voice cracking under the weight of the carnage he could hear approaching. "You destroyed it all. You took everything we built and burned it for a brat." Viktor didn't blink. He lowered his rifle just an inch, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that cut through the alarm siren. I didn't burn it for her, Yuri. I burned it because of you. You forgot the first rule of the iron. When I say I will take everything, that includes your life. The final exchange was over in a heartbeat. Yuri pulled the trigger, but Viktor was faster, a single shot finding its mark before the traitor could finish his thought. The silence that followed was absolute. Viktor dropped his weapon and stepped over the fallen king of his old world. He opened the cell door and knelt, his massive, blood-stained hand reaching out. Mia didn't hesitate. She ran into his arms, her small white dress staining red against his tactical vest. The war was over. The boss was dead. But as he carried her toward the exit, Viktor realized he had finally taken the only thing worth having. The smoke from the processing plant rose in a black, jagged pillar against the dawn, a funeral pyre for the empire of the Iron Volkov. Viktor stepped through the mangled remains of the exit, the weight of Mia in his arms, feeling lighter than the heavy burden of his crown. Behind him lay the wreckage of 3 decades, the bodies of traitors, the ashes of ledgers, and the cold, dead eyes of a man he had once called a brother. The air outside was sharp with the scent of salt and rain, a cleansing chill that seemed to wash the metallic tang of gunpowder from his senses. He didn't look back at the inferno. He knew that by sunrise, the city would be in a frenzy, the vultures circling the void he had created. But to the world, Viktor Volkov was already a ghost, a name to be whispered in the dark and eventually forgotten. He carried Mia to a secondary vehicle hidden 3 miles away in a derelict boathouse, a nondescript sedan that held no traces of the Volkov wealth or power. Inside the trunk was his final tactical maneuver: 2 sets of high-quality forged identities, a stack of untraceable currency, and a small, nondescript urn filled with charcoal ash from the fireplace of his estate. As the sun began to bleed over the horizon, casting a bruised purple light over the waves, Viktor drove to the edge of the cliffs. He set his armored SUV on a path toward the precipice, leaving the engine running and his signature signet ring resting on the dashboard. With a final heavy push, he watched the vehicle tumble into the churning Atlantic. The explosion was muffled by the roar of the surf, a distant boom that signaled the official end of the iron. For the next several months, the transition was a slow, deliberate erasure. Viktor dismantled the man he had been with, the same surgical precision he had used to build his syndicate. He moved through the coastal towns like a shadow, shedding the tailored wool coats for weathered canvas, and replacing the cold authority of his gaze with the quiet anonymity of a traveler. He watched from afar as the news reported the tragic death of the city's most feared crime boss, his empire fractured and devoured by smaller, hungrier men who didn't understand that the throne was a cage. He felt no regret. The money, the influence, and the fear he had spent a lifetime cultivating were nothing but dust compared to the sound of Mia breathing in the seat beside him. They eventually settled in a town where the name Volkov meant nothing, a place where the mountains met the sea and the winters were long enough to keep the world away. Viktor took a job as a carpenter, his large, scarred hands finding a new kind of rhythm in the grain of cedar and oak. He was no longer the man who took everything. He was a man who built things to last. He traded the tactical knife for a chisel, the silence of a killer for the quiet patience of a guardian. Mia flourished in the sunlight. The soot-stained white dress was replaced by bright sweaters and sturdy boots, her amber eyes losing their haunted stillness and finding the spark of a child who finally knew she was safe. The final scene of the Iron story didn't take place in a boardroom or a warehouse, but in a quiet public park during the height of autumn. Gold and copper leaves danced across the grass, mirroring the colors of the map they had followed to find each other. Viktor sat on a weathered wooden bench, his face hidden behind a newspaper he wasn't really reading. His frame was still massive, his presence still formidable, but the tension had bled out of his shoulders. He looked like any other father or grandfather watching over his world. He watched as Mia ran toward a group of children, her laughter a bright, clear sound that cut through the crisp air. She was a stranger to the history of blood that had paid for this moment, and that was Viktor's greatest victory. An older woman sat on the opposite end of the bench, nodding politely toward him. "Your daughter?" she asked, her voice kind and unremarkable. Viktor paused, the old instincts of the boss flickering for a fraction of a second before they were extinguished by a profound sense of peace. He looked at Mia, who had stopped to pick up a particularly bright maple leaf, holding it up for him to see with a triumphant smile. Viktor closed his eyes for a moment, smelling the wood smoke and the turning season. He realized that for 15 years he had been a king of ashes, but here, in the cold autumn light, he was finally a man of substance. "My niece," Viktor replied, his voice a low, gentle rumble that no longer carried the weight of a threat. He folded his newspaper and stood up, his hand reaching out to catch the leaf she brought him. They walked away together, disappearing into the crowd of families and strollers, two strangers to the world, but the only family that mattered to each other. The iron was gone, replaced by something much stronger, a promise kept.